I would like to say that we are deeply honored that Professors Frampton and Leatherbarrow join us tonight for the last in a series called The Human Face of Architecture, which started with Alberto Pérez-Gómez, continued with Peter Carl and many others, Christian Frost, and we come to the grand finale here. And I have to say that this entire series was conjured by Jose de Paiva, who is a great communicator and friend, and who is actually, this is a kind of farewell as well, I have to say, because Jose has decided to join the Benedictine monastery at Belmont in Herefordshire, which we look forward to visiting. But it means that after, I think we go back to Leicester in 2010, and Dalibor Vesely, who introduced me to you, and vice versa. And Jose has been an incredibly important part of the culture of our collective endeavor as a practice. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And we look forward to a continued conversation and dialogue in your new role. So, and wish you well. And it's a beautiful part of the world, Herefordshire. I think the other thing to say is that having formally introduced our guest speakers, that my relationship with David goes back to the early 1980s when Lauren and David arrived in London to go to Essex, and with Kenneth, who faced a disorganized young fella applying to the Royal College of Art and gave me a place, which was like, that is 1976, which was like the threshold to a door and life, and your lectures there, which I still have my notes from, about the European city, were completely transformative for me. So then you both disappeared for 4 decades. And life went on here, you know, as it does in this small practice that has grown and is representative, I think, of the culture of both of those, both of your incredibly fertile grounding then through academia, and hence the desire to run a series of seminars like this. And it's actually rather amazing to come back together after all that time to be able to share, after all your publications, all the incredible support to the culture of architecture through lots of practices like our own, that, you know, has provided, I think, something that is a bridge that is incredibly important between academia and practice. So thank you both for coming. I believe that there's going to be a dialogue, and it will start with David. So I'll sit down and over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's, in my view, an incredibly unique and special seminar series. Jose, it's wonderful, really wonderful. But also an honor to sit next to Kenneth Frampton in this discussion when he sits. When I first got the invitation, I immediately said yes. And then I thought, I wonder what they want me to do. Jose kindly sent me a description of the series, Human Face, and it helped a little, not a lot. Its richness overwhelmed me. But I found a line in the description. I'll read it. The series addresses key themes, such as the integration of heritage and modernity, the human scale in large-scale developments, the role of public spaces in fostering social interaction and identity. So I thought maybe I could do something on the matter of scale. Why? One person that Kenneth and I think very highly of, Adakarmi, said to me recently that there is no problem more pressing than human scale in contemporary architecture. I think she's right. I'm not sure I'll clarify the issue, probably muddy it, but in what follows, 25 or 30 minutes, I'd like to say a little bit about my sense of scale and why it's at issue today, and then end with simply one example I've found very beautiful, very helpful in thinking this problem through. It is, of course, a basic topic in architecture, important throughout architecture, from the most remote antiquity until the present, and not just in London, England, Europe, US, but no matter where architecture is practiced, I think scale is at issue. It's a primary topic in what disciplines that practice we call architecture. But today, I think it's especially pressing. Bigger and bigger cities, bigger and bigger buildings, books with sizes as their title haven't helped. And our current practices that involve what we typically call zooming in and out make sense of scale for students, but I think architects too, altogether ambiguous. I hope that I won't increase, perhaps reduce some of the ambiguity. Clarifying relationships among the parts that make up the human body, it's a little bit like drinking the ocean. One can't clarify it in 30 minutes. What is typically done in scholarship and thinking is to make comparisons. And one of the most familiar you see on the left, Leo Battista Alberti said, if we're to understand the scale relationships within the human body, think of those that define an animal. Corbusier said otherwise. The internal economy of a machine can help us understand this topic. In modern art, I am a big fan of Palozzi. You see that it's also on the horizon of concerns. On the left, strange machine. On the right, Chinese dog. Maybe the figure is something like an organic machine. I understand it to be a contradiction in terms, but in some ways that's where we might find ourselves when thinking about how to understand scale, when thinking of the body or the building as equivalent to an animal or a machine. And contemporary thinking hasn't ignored the issue. I'm an avid reader of Giorgio Agamben, and his study of man and animal is worth pursuing. In the background, in our line of work, would be comparative physiognomy, such as the work of Lebrun you see on the left, or on the right. I'm not sure if you've seen the film Ex Machina, starring Vikander, as you see here, but the matter of cyborgs has been taken up, I think, very usefully by Bernard Stiegler. Is the body to be understood as a machine? No. It's better thought of as an animal. When you follow through the analogy that undercuts all discourse on scale, and think of the building as a body. Today we have many alternatives. The so-called green roof is at once something like a living, animate, vital creature of nature, but it's surely a machine. And the confusion only extends from that first premise. So as I thought about this issue, I thought maybe leave those common approaches aside. Everyone in the room has an address. When I lived in London for 7 years, I lived at 28A Manchester Street. The house, the street, and the city. Being in the world means being in a place. And the place has distances, not just one's flat, but the street, and also the city and the wider environment of which it's part. What I'd like to try to say in my short comments today is that scale should not be thought in relationship to the human body alone. Instead, the situated body. And that situation and its implications, social, cultural, and more widely natural, are also part of the scale issue. 3 distances, perhaps. I know this phrase from Peter Carl, but have found recently that in Asian writing on art, particularly on gardens, the garden is always in the midst of 3 depths or 3 distances. So what I'd like to say is that scaling isn't just the building to the body, but rather the body that's been situated, and the internal arrangement of its parts are at the same time arrangements of what exceeds the body, basically the street, the town, and the natural world. I'm not the first to raise the issue. A rather well-known 20th century architect took it up in Precisions. And the complaint about urbanization up until, let's say, here, 1929, led Le Corbusier to a fairly familiar recommendation, return to the body. In this way, we could say with José, architecture would recover a human face. So if I have an initial question to ask tonight, it's whether the problem has been well formulated in Le Corbusier's terms. So a little bit about the word. I feel a little bit pedantic or professorial, or can't get out of my skin. Scale. It's a verb, to climb, maybe a flight of stairs or a ladder. What's key? Repetition, a regular interval. But when it's thought of as a noun, a weighing instrument, or perhaps instrument, it's not only regular intervals, but rather relationships among parts. Scale is a matter of relationships. It helps us, I'll turn to this in just a second, distinguish what today is often generalized as synonyms, size and scale. We say large scale, we mean big. Scale isn't a matter of bigness. It's a matter of relationships among constituent parts. We lose something when we forget the difference between the 2 words. Here's the dictionary definition. It's only a little helpful, but I'll give it to you nonetheless. Scale in architecture is a measurement or ratio based on the relation of architectural elements with each other and their surroundings, being in harmony with the human body's geometry. In very general terms, scale refers to an item's size in relationship to the size of something else. The hand and the arm, or the face and the body, it's the relatedness among component parts that's decisive in scale, which links it, of course, to the matter of proportionality. A is to B as C is to D. One's face and height, the capital of a column and its height. Again, the accent is on the isolated body. And I think Corbusier could be seen to confirm this, at least in part. In Precisions, he has this very, very beautiful drawing, the child and the door sized, shaped for passage, and that for the dad. My first thesis then is there's no discussion of scale without a comparison, dad to son, big to little door. And the second thesis, probably the one that if you want to quarrel with me, you'd raise as a point, is that I think scale is also a matter of an event. It's the passage through the door that links the two configurations. And in the absence of that situation or event, you wouldn't have an understanding of scale as a relationship, only size as something regular or irregular. Probably not the best day to talk about architecture in Israel. If you go to Bethlehem and the so-called Church of Nativity, there is this doorway, it's sometimes, and I think erroneously or oddly called door of humility. Lowering the lintel happened in the long history of the building, but nevertheless, quite apart from the history of the place, there is a postural or an embodied sense of the place and of its measure, and not for me and not for you, but for all of us. Countless anonymous individuals, no matter how big or small, male or female, young or old, take the same step, take the same bow before they enter the space. This is less well known though. You can see perhaps in the lower left, that's the shape of the door before the lowered lintel. And above, I made it the larger image of the three. That door has been cut into the body of the building to give another frame. Maybe this will make my argument clear. Maybe this is the best slide I have. I don't know. It's the same door. This one belongs to the human body. This one, with the arch that's been filled in, I believe it's proportioned to the body of the church. And that cut, that dent in the wall, that big frame, has been sized, proportioned to the plaza in front of the church. In other words, these are three forms of, I don't know, humility, adoration. They're events of entry from the plaza into the body of the building, from the facade into the body of the building, and from the portal into the building. That's what I call scaling a building beyond the body into the body's situation in the world. So I have a couple quick examples, familiar things that might say this or show this more clearly. Doors within doors, frames within frames. You probably recognize it. It's in Siena. Only the smallest is commensurate or seemingly sized to the discrete body. And that door and door within a door is within a series of doors that are within the body of the church and the church. So working from right to left, I guess I'd say the body, the portal, the interior, the facade, and finally the plaza as a whole. So here's my preliminary conclusion for discussion. To properly understand scale, we might need to decenter the human person. The key relationship may not be the person's physical frame, but the world in which the person lives and achieves fullness of existence. Here, I'll just go through it very quickly. It's probably now obvious. The series of frames in Il Redentore by Palladio. I've always been thinking about it, at least when I saw it for the first time in 1974, that those frames had to do with the depth of the section. You know about the controversy concerning the layout of the plan during the sort of Reformation years. And I always tried to reconcile how the plan is configured and the section and the superimposition of frames. And then I learned about, as you see here, then I learned about the Redentore Festival, third Sunday of July, set up in 1576 at the end of one of the many plagues, the same day on which Titian died. It's a procession of the Doge from the palace across the water into the Redentore. And at this point, it seems to me that Palladio is scaling the church to Venice, not to the body of the Doge alone, but actually to the body of the town. So the distances, nearby, neighboring, and remote. Near the other parts of the building, yes, the vicinity, Giudecca, and the canal. In fact, that district, but also the whole of Venice, no matter how remote it may seem. So I'll skip this. It's very clear with the reframing of the aperture and also the bays in the arcade of Michelangelo and Cappadoglio. It's the door there that he felt the need to attend to the body, but also to the passage and to the piazza out front. And this is the struggle to bind the three distances together in a single architectural element. It didn't go away in the 20th century. The mill owners, I think, is a magnificent way of scaling the size of the body to the wider frame of reference. One of Caesar's very early buildings, the Robert Ivins house, with the door within the window, framed by the aperture up above. And lastly, I'm sure you know, in Dublin, the finance building by Grafton, the door is on the far right, within a frame, within the body of the building, facing the garden on the side, but also the square out front. What I'm saying is not new to architects in this office. I believe the gate is scaled very widely to its vicinity. There's one other figure I want to mention before turning to the 20th century, the more recent case. It's hard to avoid Van Eyck's rewriting of the long-standing analogy between the body and the building, and both to the town. We tend to think of scale as a problem of measure. I don't think that's wrong. I think it's partial. I think it has to do with how we inhabit the things that have been sized. The image from Francesco, which is a little bit hard to see, the most obvious case, the stomach nourishes the body in the way that the forum nourishes the town, elbows and fortification. This is a practical and qualitative understanding of scale or of proportion. Qualitative proportioning and enacted scale is what Francesco and I think Aldo van Eyck is talking about. This is the architectural theme of covering. Hats, hoods, houses need coverings. And he's playing with the relationships that go beyond size, but rather purpose. So this is my second point for contestation. I don't think scale is dimensional alone. I think it's purposeful. I think it's qualitative. And it's another way of structuring our being in the world. So I took one of his early houses, so-called tower room, and his experience in Africa, I think, stayed with him. This, I think, is just miraculous understanding of what's at play in the famous orphanage. So I thought I'd show you one I think, very beautiful and instructive case. It's Palomenda Roca in Sao Paulo. The finishing date is 2002, usually called Plaza de Patriarchs, and it's basically a gateway through, but also down. Sao Paulo, it's 12 million people, raises a little problem of scale. Largest city in the Americas. This is a view from my hotel window. There is no horizon other than the one that's been built. A prospect without measure. That's a way of characterizing our cities. Palomenda de Roca was given a very troubled site because the buses, if you can see in the plan, were coming across the bridge and polluting the public space. So he decided to set up an arrangement where the buses would park on the bridge. There's a crossroad, and on both sides he tried to create some kind of coherent public domain, if you will, scaling the town to a place and also to particular architectural elements. As you can see in the image, is in the midst of some pretty big and some pretty short and some civically significant buildings. And I believe he's in dialogue with all of them. There is also escalators or stairway down into a lower passage, which is lined with sculptural work, terminating in a gallery, which extends still further into a green valley. So there's a whole lower landscape, the upper landscape of the tall buildings, and he's positioning his little gateway in between the two. From a distance, the frame holds its own when standing among the bigs all around. Even from above, it can't be said to be undersized, though it's small, because of the way he has configured its elements. I think its stability or even equanimity is expressed through one, uninflected planarity, two, directly legible form, and three, obviously unblemished whiteness. It's a shelter at the domestic scale. In some ways, one could characterize it as an umbrella or perhaps a tent, and tents do find their way, as they do on the streets of London, underneath this covering. It's been called a sail. Many metaphors have arisen, none of them particularly convincing. And the labor it performs is interesting. It is a shelter, it is a gateway, but most interestingly, when you stand under it, the lower edge, which is 2.5 above the deck, orients you to the public spaces all around. You actually see the city differently because of this visor, cuts off who knows what, and you have the public domain as an extension of the plaza. It's basically establishing what I think could be called a plane of regard, which resituates you in the town. You look at it and you think, doesn't look altogether stable. Well, it actually moves, but not without limit. You can see on the section, sketch section, that the one side 2.5, the other side it opens to 5 meters. That's because you're coming up the escalator, opening into the town, so you get the full height in front of you. Whereas when you enter, he lowers it to lower the horizon. So he's restructuring the space with the movement of these things. And the sketch is a study of what he called shock absorbers. So as it rotates, it reaches a point and can't go any further, or in the opposite direction. I have a quotation. It signals, the canopy signals the transition to the open spaces and views across the other side of the city. So here you see descent and the wider extension, thickening the horizon and restructuring the urban space. With a fairly small element, here you see the open edge at 5 meters high, and also emerging from the escalator on the right. So my last slide is this one. What I've tried to say is that size is not scale. The human body is not enough. the thrust of modern thinking is that the body is situated, and the situatedness suggests that we think of scale in not one, but at least three distances. I've tried to show them here. Something local, you might spend a night under that canopy. Something more to do with the public space, which has been restructured by the brim of the hat that lowers or raises. And then thirdly, on the right, that entry into or emerging from underground is only at the center. At the sides, the wider frame opens into the full depth of the town. That, I think, is scaling a work of architecture to its wider frames of reference. And there are many ways of framing, but there is only one world of reference. It's the one that we share with the rest of nature and culture. Thank you very much.
Right, very good. Okay, David, very nice to be here, hear you. I said to you when we met this evening that we've known each other for 60 years. That's just a reality, which is which has its pleasures and its sobering moments. Anyway, that was a beautiful lecture, and I learnt a lot. And that's the whole point of lecturing, I suppose. And so I think the original idea for this evening was that I should give a lecture and David should give a lecture, which I thought was just over the top. So I copped out really, basically. I decided that I would give the response. And so here I am, slightly confused by too many bits of paper. But one of the most beautiful things I think you said, if I remember correctly, was you posited the idea of a person achieving the fullness of his or her existence through this question of scale. And you mentioned, well, I think many things take the form of three, scale, ratio, event. And I think the last image you showed, which belongs to, I was very happy to see this arc of the patriarch since I first became aware of Mendes de Rocha through this structure, which I saw first in photograph, but then I had the pleasure of going to Sao Paulo and seeing it in real life. It's an extraordinary work. It's amongst the extraordinary aspects of it is in fact made out of welded steel, which is something one could perhaps miss when you first see the image. And so that's well, it's an architect I greatly admire, and it's an architect that, in a way, is both known and unknown. In that there was, I suppose it's still there, even a kind of elaborate, yes, an exhibition of his total work. In fact, in the Casa di Arquitectura in Porto. An exhibition organized by the late John Louis Cohen and Vanessa Grossman, and who is a Brazilian scholar. And it's an extraordinary exhibition, which unfortunately, well, we could set it up here in this space, which would be one place to put it, I think, because anyway, it's a very large exhibition, and there's no place in London to exhibit it. I regret to say. No RABA at the moment. The area is not big enough. Otherwise, it could, of course, it would be willing to receive it, but unfortunately, limitations of size, etc. Though this space could probably accommodate it. So it's a suggestion I'm making to Eric. He might, anyway, well, that's another topic entirely. This question of well, I think scale, ratio, and event. And it reminds me of, well, it's interesting how Team 10, which certainly involved Aldo van Eyck, but also the Smithsons, and the way the Smithsons came up with 4 scales, basically, house, street, district, city, as a criticism of the, as a phenomenological criticism, one might say, of the 4 functions of the Athens Charter. And spelling it out in terms of human experience of space and experience of scale. And of course, the examples you showed of particularly the church in Bethlehem is incredibly didactic, I think, in terms of this, of these 4 scales, you know. The entrance door to the church, which is at the level of the scale of the house, the immediate threshold outside would correspond to the street, and then by implication, of course, the district and city. And you showed all that, I think, in a very convincing way. What else to be said? I mean, I think that I've noticed something about our mutual interest, David, in that we've often been interested in architects that are slightly to one side. You know, I think you have at different times been very interested in Antonin Raymond and Richard Neutra and Aris Constantinides. These are all figures to one side of the main line. And in a way, you could say that Paolo Mendes de Rocha is, yes. Anyway, we both have this respect, I think, for this kind of architects to one side, who make very clear and discrete works that capture one's imagination, I think, even now. And so I wanted to introduce that topic. And one other thing I would like to, which we can discuss further, I think, is this term of Hannah Arendt's, which I've been kind of obsessed with ever since I first encountered the human condition, which is this term space of public appearance, which I think you are alluding to in a way, as a relational space, in fact, in which the body public and the body in general, the body as an individual, the body as a collection of bodies, is able to realize and express itself, and not only culturally but also politically, which is, of course, the key point that she makes with this term. And I think that's about all I really have to say. It's a beautiful lecture, particularly the whole issue of the door within the door. This, yes, it could be, it's very polemical, I think, in that regard. But we could open up the occasion to other comments and questions.
David, thank you so much. That was just a wonderful, actually mesmerizing lecture. And Kenneth's responses were wonderful too. I think for me, something you touched on, which really I'm going to have to go away and think about for a long time, is that scale is not a sort of measurement, it's an event. I think that's really profound. And it reminds me, I mean, I think all our lives as architects, we hear people talking about the human scale. Oh, is it human scaled? You know, and then you go skiing and you're in the Alps and they feel human scale. So, I mean, that absolutely tells you it's not about physical size, it's about imagination, it's about a sense of belonging, of home, of possibility, as Ken says, of sort of political potential. And well, I mean, I don't really have a question. I would just love to hear you reflect further on sort of maybe how you came to that realization and, you know, how you would, in a way, flesh out that idea.
It's basically because I find that the current predicament is exceedingly challenging, and I don't think I don't think you can play a guitar with one string. Dimensions are important, maybe even essential, but I don't think it's sufficient. And I think sizing in architecture is, as Kenneth has just said, relational. But for me, this is only the second string of the guitar. I believe that what people do is the subject matter of both sizing and relating things that have been sized. And I thought that covering in Alda Van Eyck or passage in the space that Kenneth has recalled in Bethlehem or in Palladio or in Mendes de Rocha, this occurrence that animates the space of appearance. It's not that something appears, but the appearing of the appearance strikes me as what is decisive. So this is not a problem of facade making. Rather, that articulation of the conditions in which an event that binds distances together might occur is what I believe is the task. And if that somewhat cumbersome and long redefinition of scale as not only sizing and not only proportioning, but somehow crystallizing ways of being in the world, I think we have the beginnings of a way of proceeding with sizes that are actually so outsized, they're almost beyond comprehension, which is my sense of Sao Paulo, of Beijing, and just name it. So when we're in a landscape that makes so little sense, I think reconsideration of these several aspects of the so-called problem of scale might provide us some headway.
Thank you. I was going to say, there was a talk a couple of weeks ago, Christian gave a talk on processions through the city, and I really found strong resonances with that as well. You know, the idea that, you know, the building, you know, across the water that appears to expect you. You know, this sense of sort of, and I think size is irrelevant. I think it's about a building or a space that seems to expect you and to welcome you. You know, I remember walking into the Campo in Siena and bursting into tears. And I've never really understood why. It was just like it expected me and welcomed me.
The other side of the issue, Carolyn, is that I think many in the room, certainly the two at the front, have been teachers for several years. And when one asks about so-called discipline of architecture, I think what disciplines this practice is the peculiarity of working in scale. When students come, they understand 1-to-1, but 1-to-200? What? It's actually a professional knowledge. The capacity to understand this is somehow going to be that. And that somehow, it's a matter of experience, of knowledge, of some failures. And also, I believe what's at issue. And it has to do with, as I think was said with Hannah Arendt, it's my life among others. And this one among many, not only at the philosophical level, but in concrete experience, is what, at least I've found when teaching people, helps them understand the architect thinks dimensionally, but more primarily in scale, in the absence of which one doesn't have architecture. One has something else. It could be sculpture, painting, God knows. But architects see in something partial the promise of something whole. And that, I think, is a knowledge that must be understood and communicated and in some ways continually nurtured if this practice is to continue. And one feels that the Zooming with our digital and highly productive methods is against the grain, what I take to be primary, actually disciplining the discipline, that knowledge. It's a practical knowledge of how to work. Buildings are big and architects are little, and how to get from one to the other, it actually is a form of knowledge, of knowing the world through that knowledge.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, this is a question for both of you, but starting with David, I'm looking at this backdrop, and
Yeah, that thing right above my head.
Yeah, and you
I'm
showed
calling it a thing.
you showed some very exquisite examples of these, how one building can scale up in various ways, in at least three ways. How would you apply it to that kind of contemporary density and scale?
With difficulty. Yeah. The reason I stress this case, to me is really smart. This closing the horizon and then also opening it, depending on where you are in the, let's call it the urban section, from 6-7 meters down to the public domain to the bigs up above. So the stratification and control of the strata and the way they present themselves strikes me as very instructive here. And it's not that this is just so tall, but the way the heights are modulated by this, both the movement and also the understanding behind and in front. No longer, not yet. Those aspects of a section, I don't think they're limited to this dimension. I have some other cases, and I think we could perhaps work analogously based on certain premises of what I call the plane of regard. And I think in tall buildings, there is a lower horizon without doubt, and there's an indeterminate middle horizon. And I think that these ways of orienting into the remote field, but also a sense of the block, I think part of the problem is everything is always everywhere open in the same way. And I think the blockages that this some things are closed and others are open. Strategic opening is perhaps one of the terms I would introduce to control orientation, and by virtue of that, where you are in the wider frame of reference. I don't have a simple answer to your question, but I do think that some cases can help us, and perhaps some vocabulary can help us think through scale at any size. And even if I don't have the answer, I'm going to maintain that that's the case.
I mean, I think that the example of the section of the Derosha is a really good example, because it's not just the cantilever, it's also the below ground relationship as well.
Yeah, this one I like a lot, this section.
Yeah.
It's very, very smart, because you have the upper horizon, and it's when you go there, you're stunned by this thing controlling a vast space. So what did I say? Uninterrupted planarity, unblemished whiteness. He's really smart that he doesn't play around. This is really strong, though it's thin metal. And something about its stability in the place. And yet there's a kind of fragility to that movement, which gives it a domestic scale. And the big frame, it's tough enough for the whole town. He's got it right. You don't need to be big to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an extraordinary work, and that well, this question of the sheer one is very aware of enormous size in the late modern world, right? Of course, the megalopolis itself is and there are many megalopoli all over the world, and this iteration of one unrelated object after another, you know. Well, if one takes the journey from the center of London out to London City Airport, one immediately becomes aware of this proliferation of objects which have no relationship to each other ad infinitum. The awareness of that, I think, is something we live with, you know, on a it's prominent. If one lives in a megalopolis, and it's very hard to escape a megalopolis, these urbanized regions, you know, have become inescapable in a way, and so one's aware of them, and what makes this building of Mendes de Rocha so powerful is it doesn't deny that that reality, but it concentrates energy over this, which is the old downtown of Sao Paulo. In fact, is what the Ark of the Patriarch is right there in the old downtown and connecting the old downtown to a lower level of the city, and it has this presence which already in a way address it because of its own scale. And the scale, because it also draws attention to the scale of the old downtown, which was much more modest, and all of that is set against this vast, in one's mind, you know, this vast, unending, almost limitless megalopolis of Sao Paulo. And there are many projects by him that are related to that idea, I think. One of the most beautiful projects is a combination of a galleria-like space in relation to a metro stop, so that the metro stop is connected, of course, to the total network of the system in relation to the megalopolis, but he introduces a kind of galleria, which is a place where, which is a complete opposite to the bureaucratic, is a completely anti-bureaucratic space, where people come to get licenses and pay for services and so on and so forth. He has made this move a number of times in relation to Sao Paulo, and it's less. In this case, the Ark of the Patriarch is less it's not programmatically determined at all, but he has also then created spaces in relation to networks, so that one can use one's imagination to recognize one's presence in a particular point, but also its connection to the larger whole. I think that's a scale issue maybe psychological scale issue, which is psychological existential, which is it's a daily challenge, I think, for all of us living in megalopolitan conditions.
It's good for non-Portuguese readers that his essays have recently been published, and he insists throughout the text, I suppose it's 300 pages, that that a city that is not for all is not a city. And when you read it, you feel, is that, anything goes or wholly inclusive? There is a politics at play here, and what is on the edge of my comments, and I believe Kenneth's about event or situatedness, this has to do with the public domain and the scaling in this plaza has to do with that space, but the extensions that are not particularly apparent but can be experienced open the local situation into the wider urban framework. And this happens here in the Sculpture Museum, in his Sesca project, and over and over and over again. He wants the locality and attendant intimacy to be conjoined with generosity and openness and extension into the still wider frames of reference. He knows as well as anyone that it is unlimited. That's what we have as our current condition. The cities are not bounded anymore. And what can one do with unlimited extension in size? Well, you can't avoid it and you can't control it, but you can participate in it. And the participation in the unmeasured, like the movement of this canopy, that strikes me as the promise of the project. Not just its intelligence, but it's also not shying away from what has been described so clearly as the condition we're facing. The cities are not limited, they're not structured. And yet, people are there, and events occur, and the institutions can be reactivated through intelligent architecture. So I also like first of all, the politics of this, but also the optimism of that politics.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Thanks. Really lovely talk and response by both of you. I was interested in many of the selections of descriptions you use, but particularly with this, the modern city is a prospect without measure, because prospect it also relates to times of representation, particularly pre-perspectival views of the city. And I wondered whether that was something or a reason why you chose that particular term, prospect without measure, or whether there was some aspect of prospect that was pretty critical.
I'll be brief. You're very discerning. It's optical, but it's also, it's more than that. Prospect is not exactly a plan, but an optimism toward what is not yet. And another thing I learned from Hannah Arendt, she has this magnificent study on Hermann Brock, his novel, Death of Virgil. And she calls it No Longer, Not Yet. And this moment that it's no longer, and it's not yet the town we would like, but it's no longer the one we recall. And this is a prospect for an urbanity we have glimpses of in some projects. It's not yet, but it's no longer the one we knew. And for me, that's the sense of prospect is. Dalibor Vesely once told me that in Prague, they define optimism as lack of information. I like it. I like it a lot. And yet, how could you do an architecture without some small, miserable shred of hope that what is not yet may yet That's my sense of prospect.
I think another thing I would add is again, Menzies de Rocha, is this question of engineering used as there's an enormous stadium, not in Sao Paulo, by him, where you can see the undercroft of the engineering structure creates a sort of human space beneath it, you know. Again, a sort of space of appearance in a way. And so the engineering form is used by him. Well, it's very Brazilian, of course. There's a whole tradition of it, but he makes a particularly bold use of it, I think. And yeah.
This is a bit of a homecoming for me. I first met David when he saw the Redentore, along with Dalibor and Danny Liebeskind. And Ken was my first teacher. And
See what you wrought?
Yeah, right.
well, I was a terrible student. And one thing I've learned in my retirement is how really dumb I am. In any case, Ken has become a kind of North Star of what architecture could stand for, that kind of ethical and, or at least for me, a kind of ethical and political aspirations that it should have. And maybe for most people here. But one of the things that I got from this conversation was that scale became apparent in a kind of moment of contemplative intensity, and that there was a kind of tactility to it. The opposite end was the anonymity of huge cities, Beijing, Chongqing, blah, Tokyo even. But there's a commitment to city that involves commitment to, okay, if a place like Beijing is immense, or Shanghai, and just becomes sort of anonymous in its repetitiveness and so forth, there's another version of city that veers between excitement and violence. And, you know, people used to go to the East End, not because it was a university, but because it was slightly dangerous. There was kinds of knowledge that were, you know, call it urban myth or something, that was kind of street knowledge, that's probably the term, that is a kind of cunning, and takes an immense amount of what you have been speaking of for granted in its ways of navigating, in its ways of putting together. You know, that there's vast dimensions of Jakarta, which are made up of, you know, what you call practical understanding, but it's also full of deals, duplicity, you know, midnight supply of materials, like Barrios. And I just wonder if this business of scaling isn't a way of belonging even to something that isn't contemplative, that's actually has this kind of visceral life, that you kind of need each other because you can't survive without each other, even though you're afraid of everyone you talk to.
I'll make one comment. Peter, I'd like to follow that line of argument, but I also want to make a little apology for architecture as a form of knowledge. Architecture as a way of knowing the world, where I am in the world, where I've been. In other words, that this instrument of orientation is for the citizens, people who are not citizens, that there is a sense of coming up that escalator. The town opens and it's bright and it's windswept and it closes. And this, the knowledge that the building supports or is your awareness of where you are in the world. This strikes me as a contribution to urbanity that is, as was said, independent of program, independent of it's in the operations of that metal chunk in the town that I don't have a name for. Everybody has different names for it, but everyone knows things about the city through it. And this is just in parenthesis within a broad cultural depth we call the city. There is a role for the structuring that architecture accomplishes. And what I'm trying, at least partially tonight with you, is to say that a hackneyed, tired, threadbare vocabulary, including words like scale, can be rethought and reanimated as part of our ways of acting in this scaleless, unmeasured world that is ours. I don't know if it's a vain or fruitless effort, but I think it may be incumbent on us to know the limitations, but also the necessity of the work in its own right, and also the vocabulary that disciplines our practice. And I'm reluctant to abandon both, and that's sort of an apology for my care for the work itself.
Very nice to hear that conversation appear again. I sort of believed it all then, and I still believe it now very passionately, everything you're saying. And I think the addition that I noticed tonight was this notion of the event.
Mm.
And I like Peter's comments about how the way people live in the city is its continual construction and how people participate in that construction. And we have been in Africa a bit recently. And that picture you showed of the guys carrying the roof, it kind of, I had a kind of aha moment when I saw that actually happening in Kassler. It made me realize that I hadn't really understood before how that construction, for example, is made in order that people can carry it. It's like the barn raising, that the proportionality, the scaling of it is down to the grass size and how you bind the joints and how you need 8 men or whatever it is to make that construction. And how the community of construction is an entire dimension within the problem of scale that gets obliterated by a lot of modern construction techniques. And it's very nice to be able to kind of see that and say, because particularly when you look at traditional architecture, think how, in fact, do we understand how that was scaled as a way of making?
Yeah.
And I know that you guys have written very poetically and informatively about the notion of materials in construction. So I was going to get you to segue in.
I would just
to
want to
this
make
issue.
a somewhat biographical comment. When Kenneth's book came out, the Tectonic Culture book, we all, didn't put it down for a long time. And I was asked to write a review of it, and I was nervous, and tried my best. And this simple and beautiful sense of a framework and an earthwork, there's a sort of private domain and something kind of under the. I said that Kenneth's account of the Tugendhat Villa with private spaces and the public spaces, earthwork framework, clarified for me how the way of building was also an outgrowth of a way of living. Ways of living and ways of building as a tectonic culture in which there is a sense of the social and of the private in the body of the fabric, the body of the building. And Kenneth then so kindly wrote back to me and he said, I'm going to look at Tugendhat Villa again.
Right.
You remember this?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes.
Can I suggest that actually we break into something more informal and enjoy a bite to eat and to drink? And I would like to say, you know, how fantastic the occasion was. We're really privileged to conclude this. I see another opening, which I'm reminded of by a 2-hour lecture you gave at the RCA in that series about the city and theatre.
Oh, yes.
And I can't help feeling that a lot of the conversation has been about that sense of anticipation, theatricality that is so much part of the city and would perhaps be the beginning of another series.
Mm.
So,
Yes. I mean, this question of an occasion, you know, that you make me think, in alluding to the theatre, you know, that's the important thing about the theatre is this moment that's an occasion, you know, an event. Yeah, I think
and
that's
you introduced me through that to Adolphe Appia
yeah, right.
and that sense of another part of architecture, which, you know, the scaling issue, which is so interesting. I've always been in awe of the way in which, from an architectural perspective, moving the other way, the scale of a building like the Pantheon, with its anticipation of its interior and the city, you know, can be measured down to the way somehow that those giant columns, the framework for the doorway, you know, ultimately ends up at a handle, at a sort of way of engaging physically with this huge building. And I think a number of the precedents you show, you know, come to that sense of how the architect, the designer of, you know, narrative and anticipation and event, in terms of framework, is intimately related to the issues you've been talking about today.
Yes, you remind me a bit of Palismar's idea that the door handle is the handshake of the building.
Yes. Yes.
Yes,
Well,
the handshake of the building.
a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.